Episode 31, Violin Virtuoso, Nicola Benedetti. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Nicola Benedetti. Nicola is one of the most sought-after violinists of her generation. She is one of the most influential classical artists in the world and has played with the finest orchestras and symphonies from around the globe. She was the BBC Young Musician of the Year at age 16, twice the Female Artist of the Year at the Classical BRIT Awards, and has sold millions of records. Nicola, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. So you began violin lessons at the age of 4. It's pretty hard to fathom. Were you that passionate about music at that age, or were your parents somehow involved in that decision?
I was certainly not passionate about music when I was 4. I didn't even know what a violin was or had never listened to any classical music. I copied my older sister, and that's the only reason I began. And my parents were not musical either. They didn't play any instruments. So it was very much a case of let's try and see. And first couple of lessons were quite traumatic because I'm left-handed. So I wanted to play the instrument the other way around. But once I got over that, I would say within a month or two, I was starting to play something that sounded like music and that had an emotion to it. And once that became apparent, like I began to be exposed to what the core of the expression of music actually is.
Could you expand on that? What do you mean by the emotion of the music?
Well, the pieces of music that I was playing, they all have a story, they all have a sentiment, they all have a specific emotion to them that I think of course it's possible to play that music and to not be moved by that, but I was extremely moved by it, even at the age of 5.
Do you have any memories going back to sort of 5, 6, like picking up the instrument and getting moved emotionally from it?
Yeah, my memories are more about the music than about the instrument. You know, like memories from that age, you're never sure whether you've just been told the stories a million times or whether you actually remember them, but I've certainly also been told many stories of me being like moved to tears by pieces of music that I was playing when I was extremely young. So I had a really visceral reaction to it. And
that's very uncommon, I would think. Children that age having that type of visceral reaction.
I mean, it's not unique by any stretch of the imagination, but it's quite uncommon, I think. Yes, I think my mum was probably quite surprised to see that.
And so you start playing and you took to it. At what point did it start to, I guess, consume a lot of your life? What kind of childhood did you have? Let me ask you that. I mean, how much time was the violin versus having friends and other hobbies and activities and that sort of thing?
A few moments stick out in my memory of it being practice or going to a party or practice versus something else. And the choice was always really mine. But I felt already by the age of 7, a huge responsibility and obligation to the violin. So more often than not, that is what I would choose to do. In saying that, I'm not giving the impression like I was one running to practice all the time and that it took no exterior force to make me understand what discipline was. That was very much down to my mother, and she really taught both me and my sister what it was to improve at something, what it was to do it every day, what it was to incrementally build up an understanding of focus, time, concentrating on something and trying to improve it. And that was that's a slow process, but she was very intelligent with how she did it. Just start 5 minutes, then 10, then 15, then 20, and I would say I wouldn't say I have the most sort of fun and games memory of my childhood, but I don't feel any iota of a regret towards that, or even some kind of negative feeling. I mean, I understood that if I wanted to get good at something, I had to be serious about it. And my mum was also very strict about us not trying a million hobbies and a million disciplines at once. So it was kind of like you picked something if you had a love for that, and if you wanted to do it, that was what you did.
Which is very smart of her to do, and almost somewhat antithetical to how most parents these days think about, which is I got to expose my kids to every possible hobby and activity, and they're overexposed. Their time isn't their own, and they end up not being excellent in any one thing.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
I think it's a huge topic to debate, of course, and there's so many nuances and models that completely fit different cultures and different individuals. But for me, I think there are certain threshold barriers that you have to learn to push through. And once you've learned how to do that with one thing, it's applicable to whatever it is you then do choose to devote your life to. So I think an overexposure to too many possibilities and too many subjects, it just breeds that kind of impatience, and it can breed that sort of whatever the opposite of the calmness and steady hand and steady mind and steady heart that you need to have in order to really kind of tie yourself to something and dedicate yourself to it. And I think that is a skill. Once you've kind of worked through those pain barriers with one thing, you can then apply it to something else.
I think the one caveat, if you will, is you somehow, I don't know if it's luck or what it is, but you found something that it seems like at a very, very young age was very passionate about, something that really moved you. And I think part of the problem is, like we talked about with the parents, I think part of it is also people, whether children or adults, honestly, finding something that really moves them to the point where they want to block out everything else in their lives and have that type of focus. And
I totally agree. And that's where I was going with the nuanced approach. I mean, I as many times have seen people kind of forcing an instrument down someone's throat, and it's so obviously not where their particular creativity lies. I do think exposure to music and to subjects that I guess fall under a creativity bracket, I think there's no child that is better without having that experience. But because I think it just permeates so much else that you try to put your hand to in life. But I do think that if it's obvious that physically someone is just not connected to their instrument and they cannot get to a place where there's a sense of fulfillment, I do think that's probably a good moment to just try something else. But it's a delicate balance.
I think you were just 10 years old when you left your family to live in London to study at a well-known music school. Was that a really hard thing to do, leaving behind family and friends?
Right. My memory of it is the overriding sensation I had was, how can I get better at playing the violin? And I knew that as much as I adored my teacher, in Scotland, I was not getting what I needed anymore. And she was the first one to say it. She was a wonderful teacher, but she was saying, Nikki's playing pieces of music that I've never played and can't play, so she needs another kind of tuition. So I was overwhelmed with that desire, like, how am I going to just sound better at the violin? And although there were all kinds of other very normal and expected emotions that I went through of leaving, I remember the first time I was dropped off at the school and my mum left, and this was actually only for the kind of 3-day trial stay that you have 6 months before deciding whether or not to go to the school, because it's really not for everybody. And my mum left, and oh wow, the feeling in the pit of your stomach is just horrific, to be kind of separated from your parents. And then of course it's even worse when you know it's for months. But I think that was that feeling was replaced with the challenge that my new teachers were presenting me with. I mean, it was such an incredible shock to the system, all of this new information. And they had a kind of style that was kind of take you back to the beginning and redo most of what you've learnt. And that resulted at the beginning in this kind of, I was playing open strings again and I was going way back in terms of my development. But she had such an absolutely magical way with the fundaments of your physical relationship to your instrument, your own relationship to your own physicality, and your storytelling relationship to music. And she was so just absolutely masterful with how she dealt with all of that. And to the point where, 6 months into studying at school, I was a different player. I mean, it was just incredible, the speed with which everything improved.
Clearly, you're moving a step at a time or several steps at a time to get better and improve and take yourself to the next level. At what point in your life did you decide that you wanted to become a world-class violinist? Not just great, but one of the best in the world. Was it at that age or was it later on in life? Or did you ever sort of make some type of long-term goal like that?
No, I just never considered not playing, and I never went through a period of not wanting to practice. Those are the only consistencies I had. I never had... I didn't even know what a soloist was. I mean, we didn't come from that kind of culture of going to concerts and even going to art galleries and understanding what that type of our artistic understanding and appreciation was. I mean, our family, our whole extended family is just not of that type of mindset. And so much was just discovering for the first time when I would encounter other children from very different backgrounds. And there were a few of us at Menuhin School, a Yehudi Menuhin School, that were like that, didn't come from a culture of playing and of music, but very few. Most of the children had done. I certainly never made any type of decision of I want to become this type of soloist or I want to become a soloist. Or
it was simply you wanted to improve and this is what you need to do.
This is what you need to do. And then opportunities presented themselves. And of course, there was no question in my mind that, yes, this is kind of what it was all for. It's also so out of your hands. I mean, you can decide something like that and it just never happens. And other people never thought about it and it does happen. I mean, the amount of variables that go into successfully making it through so many barriers and boundaries in order to have a livelihood that is performing and playing a solo instrument in front of people. Yeah, it's a very precarious, quite random, extremely challenging, tough climb, so I think in some ways the fact that I was but my sense of self was so inextricably linked to just how I was playing and how I was improving, that saw me through so many ups and downs, because that's where my priority lay, and that doesn't actually depend on whether you have concerts or not, or whether somebody says you're good or not. It just depends on your relationship to your instrument. It's a very, very intimate, very personal thing.
It's interesting. There's different philosophies. Some people say that if you don't have a career goal, a life goal, then you don't know where you're going. And if you don't know where you're going, then you can never get there. But it sounds like from your growing up, it was just really focused on how do I get better at and better and better and let everything else just sort of take care of itself, as opposed to perhaps setting yourself up for failure by aspiring to some level that you may never get to or something like that.
Right. I mean, I think the idea of what inspires people, what keeps people motivated, what allows one to really improve and to be focused on that improvement. I may be a little idealistic in my own memory of what kept me so focused for so long, because I was never short of the chance to play for people. And it went in huge, tumultuous ups and downs of having massive opportunities and then really playing badly in some of those very exposed circumstances, and then having a record deal possibly too young that I then, I fulfilled well and did good recordings. It was a very, very varied experience. But the consistency throughout it was the chance to play. From the age of 16, I could play easily 150 concerts a year. So, that in itself, because I have never been in a position without that type of motivation and without those constant small goals and larger goals, I don't know if I'm entirely best placed to know how serious my work would be had they all been taken away,
Your former teenage violin teacher, Brenda Smith, once said that beyond your technical mastery, you had this natural stage presence. So for those of us that aren't classical music aficionados, what exactly does that mean in terms of playing an instrument? It's not like you're in this heavy metal band, jumping up and down and doing splits and banging your guitar. So what does stage presence mean?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because it lives in very subliminal, subtle worlds. It's not really something that if I were to quantify and write out a table of let's tick these 6 boxes, you could tick them all and someone could still not have stage presence. It's not dissimilar to how a person makes others feel when they enter a room. So different people have different vibrations. They have a different kind of energy. They have a very different presence. And those around you are affected by that in a myriad of ways. And the same thing is true, but magnified on a stage. And I think a lot of what we do, because so much of the work of a classical musician and even though I hate the word training, you could say the training of a classical musician is to develop such specific skills and highly challenging skills and abilities. That component of being your most authentic self and giving and exposing as much of who you are through the music you play to people when you're on stage. That's something that if you're like me and you tend to think a lot and question a lot and process a lot of that sort of questioning mindset, that's a tricky thing to work your way through. And I think your stage presence does grow the more in touch with who you are you can be. But, it's something that people have said about me since I was very young and have continued to say throughout the years. I mean, even people who don't like my playing, I think, would probably agree with that. And I don't know what it is. I don't know why. I don't know. But it's certainly, I'm much more comfortable leaving it up to something more spiritual than trying to define what those qualities are.
Well, let's get into the technical mastery part of things. When you're not performing, or maybe even on the days you are performing, what's your daily practice like? How many hours are we talking about?
It varies so enormously. I gave up on routine scales and exercises quite a few years ago. There's so much about my way of playing and my path with music and with the violin that's really unconventional. It doesn't really fit into any school. And I think with time, the more time that passed between my consistent studying with a professor, with a violin teacher, the more time that passed, the more I went in the direction of my way of playing and further away from all of these kind of schools, although I would of course not be the violinist I am today without them, and I'm endlessly grateful for all of that information. I think I've come to a place of embracing my kind of unique physicality and setup, as everybody should do.
Let me ask a different question. If you look back at when you were 4 years old, right, all the way to the point where you were performing around the world on a regular basis, what sort of practice did that take? And let me get more specific. Are you familiar with the 10,000 hour rule? Okay. So for those listening, it was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. It came originally from research from Anders Ericsson, who's a professor, a Swedish professor at Florida State, which essentially states that it takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice, and specifically deliberate practice, not any kind of practice.
Right. Good practice.
Right. I mean, very, very good, practice to become world-class in any field. And I guess the question is, do you subscribe to that? I mean, do you think by the time you got to be that level, I mean, I know you're not sitting here calculating, but did it take that type of intensity and over that duration to get to that point?
My understanding is there's no exception to that rule. You can have the most phenomenal natural talent, and I have seen so many of them. If that is coupled with a complete lack of discipline and focus and simply hours, but deliberate practice, sensible practice, intelligent practice is definitely an operative word, because there's a enormous difference. I would say I have come across so many talented people that have never fulfilled their potential because they weren't willing to put in the work. I've seen some people who are less talented who have put in the work and who have developed so phenomenally, but equally the opposite is true. I mean, there's lots of people who work very hard that just don't have those other magical components. They don't have the makeup that is required in order to develop into a great musician.
Is it the natural talent they're lacking or something else?
It's why I'm saying magical combination of things. It is so many things, and it's why I'm not a religious person really, but I have a general position of extreme humility of the unknown and acceptance that there is so much unknown. And in all of my kind of ridiculous philosophical arguments about religion with people, or about a very practical kind of mindset that actually believes if you just continue to add little bits of information and continue to expand knowledge in certain areas, then you will eventually get to a certain understanding, to a certain absoluteness in your understanding of your environment and the people you communicate with and everything you interact with. And my strongest argument against that way of thinking is that through all the hours that I have practiced and all the time that I have spent really focused on trying to improve, in the end, it is such an overwhelming number of components that have to come together, much like you encounter in any single field, in any interaction, in any personal experience that you have. It's such an overwhelming number of factors that it has to be something spiritual, something magical, something that is way beyond an aggregation of information and of hours of practice. There's something else in there that you could never write in a book. You could never put on a graph. You could never bottle it up and give it to someone and teach them exactly these things and they would become that. It's something far more complex than that. And so, yes, the 10,000 rule, I would say you cannot get to a certain level of mastery without that. But if you do that, does it mean you'll get there? No.
Are you familiar with something called the flow state?
Yes. It remind me?
Yeah, so in positive psychology circles, flow is, and I'm going to somewhat simplify it, but yes. Flow is defined as this mental state in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus and so absorbed in the activity they lose track of time. It's almost like being in the zone. And it often occurs when the body or mind is stretched to its absolute limits and you're accomplishing something truly difficult. And so, if you think about the times when you're really trying to push yourself, a new piece or improve your technique, and some of this maybe it was more in your past than today. Does that sound like something familiar, that you enter this state where you could be playing for hours and hours on end and wouldn't know it was any more than 5 minutes because you're just so absorbed and immersed in the activity? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I would say that happens in most performances. I mean, ideally that happens in most performances. A sense of music, of course, challenges and poses questions to the experience of time anyway. That can expose itself from very small components dialogues and arguments between musicians about what is faster or slower, and how subjective that is and how malleable that is. But it also presents itself in this sort of timeless feeling. It's not just a timeless feeling in terms of you actually sensing that you have played for 30 minutes or 45 minutes, but it's also a kind of emotional timelessness. And I think flow is a very good term to use, because you are in a state that encompasses so much. It's too much for the brain to compute. And it's so overwhelming that it all then becomes one thing. And I see that mirrored in so many conversations in so many disciplines. I mean, people who have extensive historic knowledge, they've studied it their entire life. What they tend to then do is to condense so much of their understanding more and more into these kind of smaller nuggets, which, of course, if you were to probe, can then be broken up into a million thoughts and realizations. But they have gone through this process of kind of condensation. And I think, I mean, listening to scientists talk, I always think that if you hear somebody talk about quantum physics, it's like, it's overwhelming, the amount of questions that are out there, that it becomes about something very fundamental. And this might sound a bit abstract, but the actual experience of the greatest moments of music making that I have had, that is what they feel like. I feel like time, space, my emotional understanding, my experience, all becomes this one powerful sensation. And your mind is not thinking or analyzing it, because it's too much to take in. So it becomes like a state.
Do you ever get nervous when you perform?
Yes, to huge variety of degrees. I mean, sometimes I will shock myself how not nervous I am, and other times I'm nervous for an entire day, can't relax, rest, can't rest my mind at all. And those days feel like an endless battle. That's what nerves feels like to me, because I know it's not rational. I mean, 10 years ago, it may have been rational for me to be nervous, because half the time I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. But now, basically, I know what I'm doing, and I do have a certain reliance and confidence in my playing, in the person that I am, and what I have to give. But nevertheless, that sensation, that totally irrational sense of fear, rears its head. And on the one hand, I embrace it, because it shows how much I still care about this experience, and I've not developed any apathy towards it whatsoever. But for me, the hardest component of my life is dealing with that feeling.
Any technique you use to try to just calm yourself down and get through that period, or do you let it just happen knowing it's going to be okay in the end?
I do have a level of acceptance. I don't panic about why, or think this is crazy, or I've got to get rid of this, or see a life coach in order to become a constantly confident person. I mean, I think it's a vulnerable, deeply uncomfortable state to be in, but that is also an honest place to be in. Asking yourself very uncomfortable questions, and sometimes those experiences are life-changing for me and are very memorable. And I do have an element of acceptance and just embracing it. That's a component of my personality, and I deal with it. But I do, of course, have like certain ways of breathing, certain ways of trying to. I find it's all in the mind anyway. I mean, I don't find that there's much I can do physically other than be warm and not cold. There's much I can do physically to really alter that. It's a question of mind over matter, and me getting myself into a state that forces any nervousness or apprehension out of my hands and out of my arms, and perhaps into some other part of my body.
Are you ever disappointed with your own performance? Like you didn't hit certain notes just right, or maybe you didn't bring as much energy or emotion as you would have liked? Are you your own worst critic, or are you generally pretty pleased with how you've done and move on to the next one?
No, I'm extremely critical, horribly critical. I mean, I often will come off stage and give an account of what I did to the people closest to me, like you have 3 or 4 people that you tell how your concert went, and I don't know what percentage of time, but it wouldn't be a small percentage of the time that I tell them it was a disaster, and more often than not, there's a recording of the concert, and then I'll listen to it. I'm like, what? That was actually okay. Why did I think that? So they don't even really pay much attention to my very critical.
Well, not to mention that, these minor issues you're hearing because of, your trained ear. 99.99% of the people will never have heard whatever it is you even if you could hear it in replay.
Yeah,
no one else would have heard it.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, and that's another level of. The thing is, I'm terrible at acting anything. So, like on stage, for me, it's interesting that you also asked about stage presence, because I think people do associate a stage presence with the show must go on no matter what, and you give this kind of bravura and confidence and sort of, here I am, I'm demonstrative way of being on stage, and I'm so absolutely the opposite of that. And if I don't feel secure, like, can people tell? No, probably not anymore. I mean, because of the amount of experience I have, but I don't act on stage at all. I don't show something that I'm not feeling. But you always have to remember at the back of your mind, you don't actually know how you sound. You don't actually know how you're playing. So often you're wrong because you're in an extreme state of heightened sensitivity. So ignore negative thoughts is the key to the game.
So I think it was your 2012 album, The Silver Violin, which not only topped the classical charts, but the top 30 pop album charts as well. It's incredibly rare to have that kind of crossover appeal. So why do you think you're able to have it?
I think that particular album was a time and place that suited the music I recorded, and it's a lot of events that summer, a lot of things that I was doing that culminated in a kind of a joint investment in promoting this disc, getting it out there, and there was enough music on it that was relatable enough to people. So there was Korngold Concerto, 2 other pieces by Korngold. All the rest of the works on the disc were either written for film or they were music written by a classical composer that was used in film, like Mahler Piano Quartet. And the album did incredibly well in terms of sales. It wasn't just like an instant kind of top 30 for the first few days and then it dipped.
But you don't think, I know you're very modest and I appreciate that, but there's got to be more than just, well, it was the right music and the right time, the right audience. I mean, there's you. People somehow are attracted to your music that maybe traditionally wouldn't be sitting there listening to classical music or going to concerts. I didn't know if that was maybe a goal of yours to try to widen the audience, or it just sort of happened on its own.
It is and has always been a goal of mine, but I've become a little reticent about that term because I learned with recording however many CDs I've recorded, like 10 or 12, that a lot of the time reaching out to a wider audience is code for playing something that I don't really consider to be classical music. And it's not that I am trying to categorize in any kind of hierarchy the music of like good or bad or whatever, but I'm a classical musician. It's the music I love the most. It's the music I'm most excited about. It's what I listen to. It's what I would listen to all the time. And a lot of those discussions, they push you in a variety of directions. So it was a sad realization for me. I mean, I used to think that if Shostakovich Violin Concerto is marketed in exactly the same way, enough money is pumped into it, enough adverts are put on television, enough of this, enough of that, that people would gravitate towards that phenomenal experience as much as they would a pop tune. But it's just not true. I don't even think there's any problem with that at all. It's just, I mean, of course, I wish that culturally more people were interested in music that developed, music that had a complexity to it, music that were written by individuals of such profundity. I wish there was more intrigue towards that, but it is what it is. And so when it comes to something like Silver Violin, I don't think that would have been as successful had I not recorded Gardell's Tango and Schindler's List. And I've yet to get a full breakdown on what percentage of downloads and of bought CDs, there's no way to know how much people are just listening to those tracks and moving past the Korngold Violin Concerto. I would hope that there's something of a balance there, and that at least some people made a journey and a step into another style of music, into listening to an entire concerto, into listening to music of that type of complexity. But it's a very difficult path to walk, especially when in your heart of hearts you are a populist, which I kind of am. I basically believe the more people that are exposed to something, the better. But at what point does the thing you're exposing have to morph into something that's not what you believe in? It's been a long learning curve that will continue throughout my life, I'm sure.
Help me understand what separates a great violinist from an exceptional violinist, a world-class violinist. Maybe a first string at a major symphony orchestra versus someone who travels the world performing. Help me understand that last step to get to that level. First
of all, no, I don't think that everybody can tell the difference. Especially if you were to do some sort of blindfold test. I think the level of actual instrumental playing by so many people who lead orchestras and who don't have solo careers, we have definitely worked out how to be really great and really competent at the violin. There has been so much studying, so much work, so much accumulative knowledge and information. People can really play now, and lots of people can really, really play. But that added thing that is appropriate to a soloist position, that's kind of more rare. And I don't think of it like a lot of people do. They kind of think the soloist is, in terms of discipline, the top of the chain. I tend to think of it more horizontally. Like there are different types of musicians that are just appropriate to different types of things. And I mean, am I a more competent or better or stronger violinist in every category than somebody who leads a first class excellent orchestra? Definitely not. There's many things that I have that are weaknesses, but for some reason, whatever it is, I'm someone that has been appropriate to this role, the role of a soloist, the role of somebody who kind of stands up and delivers that very personal, individual quality. I see it more, like I said, more and a kind of different skills within your instrument. Different people have different strengths, and a certain type of violinist has a strength that suits the soloist mold on stage, suits that position.
Let's go back to, we were talking earlier about education, and you're being really passionate about music education in the schools. As parents, I think a lot of us struggle with, most kids don't take to musical instruments the way you took to the violin. So how much do you push them? You're obviously a very, rare sample of what you did with an instrument. Why is it so important to you? What do you feel children get out of music beyond just the mastery of that instrument itself? It sounds like to you there's something beyond that it does.
Oh, without a doubt. And it can exist on many different fronts. I mean, there is the listening to music of such complexity and such depth, and music that develops to a certain level. So that doesn't just go A, B, A, B, A, and ends. Music that has the kind of colorfulness and the fantasy of what an orchestra provides. So that's just purely from a listening perspective. Then the historical context that can come along with listening to music from different times, from different cultures. Within classical music in particular, one of the greatest gifts of it that I see so many classical musicians actually just not embracing or really caring about, which hurts me, is more philosophically the idea of forcing yourself into the mindset of someone that is nothing like you. And I try to do that like both feet first with every single composition that I play. So how close can I get to who I thought Beethoven was, and how far away from myself can I be, and how much can I accept that? Can I embrace it? Can I not try to pull them towards me, but can I step out of myself? And I think there's a lesson in empathy and understanding in a kind of collegial love and acceptance for other people that can be learned if that is taught and, you know, illuminated in the study of music, and there's in the study of playing instruments. So much of the time it's an entire subject that's just ignored. Then of course there is the much more kind of practical skill set that comes along with not just learning an instrument, all of which are extremely challenging and very difficult. And I get very up in arms when music is considered like a soft, easy subject. I just want to ask anybody to try to play an instrument well, and they'll know how not true that is. But to have an individual skill, then fit that into a community of people that are trying to do the same thing, and you're trying to make harmony with them and play in rhythm with them, that does something to the brain, which is kind of pulling it to opposites. So you're trying to, yes, play your individual thing, to bow straight, to play in tune, to make a good sound. But at the same time, you have to be constantly aware of, am I early? Am I late? Am I too loud? Am I too soft? How am I harmonizing with those around me? And the same kind of pull of opposites takes place with the very kind of disciplined skill set that's required in order to play well. That's juxtaposed against the requirement of playing music, which is to express something and to say something, which should be a very freeing feeling, should be a very kind of open and anything goes kind of feeling. So to balance those two is another set of opposites that you experience and have to master if you want to play music well. Communication, listening, being aware of those around you. The number of potential, and I say potential because I see horrific music teaching going on all over the world that really doesn't highlight any of these potential skills. But the number of potential skills that, regardless of whether you go on to play a musical instrument or not, whether music is a part of your future or not, that are kind of harbored within that experience is phenomenal. But underlying or undergirding all of that is a belief that I have, which is that the pieces of music written by the greatest of composers over time are some of the highest creations that humans have managed to come up with. And that I do think in school, just like the greatest novels, the most incredible scientific discoveries, and I think it's something that should just be, look, this is what this person managed to do. Here's how they did it. Let's just marvel at this for a second, because it's truly unbelievable. So that's just like a tiny snapshot of why I think, but I could go on forever.
No, that's great. When you've achieved this kind of extraordinary success, at such a young age, what keeps you going? Like, is there anything you'd like to accomplish that you haven't? Or is it just performing and enjoying the music in and of itself, and just keep doing what you're doing and don't worry about where it leads?
Oh, I'm always worried about where it leads, because I'm largely dissatisfied with how I play. So I absolutely have the opposite problem of some of these prodigies that were like just perfect when they were 13 or 15 or even 17. I mean, I have just had so much developing to do throughout my life playing the violin, and continue to feel that way. I perceive myself and my own playing not as having arrived anywhere at all.
Here you are today, still looking at how do I improve my technique and get even better.
Oh, all the time.
But you don't have a teacher anymore, right?
No, so it's a real self-discovery, but it's just going deeper into listening to what I'm doing and trying to problem solve. It's something I tell kids to do all the time. Like, nobody actually knows how your body feels other than you. Nobody has an idea. A teacher can be an excellent teacher and perceive what they think are the problems, but you have to know. So try to apply your creativity to problem solving when it comes to how to improve. So that's just what what I do all the time. So I have no sense of arrival, really. And I, curse that sometimes, but there's other times that I'm so grateful for it, because a lot of people really do arrive at a level of mastery in the kind of soloist profession at such a young age. They get lost after that. They don't know where to go or what to do. I never have that problem. I've got so many things I need to get better at. So,
who would you say has had the greatest influence in your life?
I would say my mother has had an enormous influence. I would say certainly all four of my kind of major violin teachers have had enormous influences on me.
Anyone famous that when you were a kid you looked at and say, I want to be like them when I get older?
No. I've never had that kind of adoration for a person for some, I guess the most inspiring figures to me are those who have encountered the most intense disappointment and adversity and still have managed to maintain a positivity and have maintained a kind of motivation for change. But those figures are far more, political or activists, or they're not really musicians.
The name of this podcast is called The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence? What does it mean to you?
I think a level of application to a specific field, a dedication to it, a relentless work ethic to that. And within whatever it is you specialize in, people who are really achieve excellence to me are the ones that are always asking the largest of questions that don't just pertain to their skill or to their field. Ones that, the scientists and mathematicians and musicians that really are trying to work out the big unknowns, and they are able to then infuse what they do with those type of larger philosophical questions. That is a component of excellence, I guess, that has its own power. All the greatest of composers had that quality in abundance. They were more often than not constantly in tumult and just lived a life of angst through asking those questions and being unable to answer them, but they tried. So I think there is the discipline, the dedication, that kind of relentless work ethic, but there's also that other side, which is, what is your worldview and how do you infuse your skill with that understanding?
I like that. Nikki, you have had an extraordinary career. I appreciate your humility, but very few people in the world, get to your level, and you've barely gotten going. I feel really old sitting next to you, but you're so kind to take time out, I know, of a very, very hectic schedule and share your story. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.